Hello and welcome to the MECERN podcast. I'm Karen Culver, and today it is my pleasure to host Professor Christian Raffensperger. Christian is the Kenneth E. Ray Chair in the Humanities at Wittenberg University in the USA. As a historian, his scholarly goal has been to connect Eastern Europe, particularly the Kingdom of Rus, into the larger medieval European world. His books, such as Reimagining Europe, Kievan Rus in the Medieval World, Harvard University Press 2012, and Conflict, Bargaining and Kinship Networks in Medieval Eastern Europe, Lexington 2018, are part of that process. His current project is entitled Rulers and Rulership in the Arc of Medieval Europe 1000 to 1200, and attempts to shift the discourse about kings, queens, and rulership in general, as well as to challenge our geographical imagination of medieval Europe. He is currently working on this project as the Archie K. Davis Fellow at the National Humanities Center in the USA. Christian is also an active member of MECERN. Christian, welcome to the MECERN podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I've read the outline to your forthcoming monograph, The Rulers and Rulership in the Arc of Medieval Europe, 1000 to 1200, which you are currently working on. You state in the outline that the idea of medieval Europe is largely one defined by the Roman Empire's successor states in the West, with particular focus on England and France. Why do you think this is? What is the cause of this alleged focus?
I think that there are many reasons. One is a larger world historical or Western historical narrative that starts with Greece and goes to Rome and goes to England and then goes to eventually America. When I talk about this in class, a shining city upon a hill, everything is wonderful. So there is that point by point that connects Greece to modern democracy. That's one reason. Another reason simply is England and France were medieval kingdoms who became modern states. And it's very easy to trace those medieval kingdoms back to the modern states and thus reify that modern national identity. One of the big problems with this is that they get taken as normative. England and France become what medieval Europe was. Partly this could be because of the dominant scholarship of the Anglophone and Francophone worlds, but you see it as well in the German reaction to those two lines of thought as the German scholars developed their own Sonderweg. Right? They had to have a different path than the English and the French. And so it's really not just those of us who work in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, East Central Europe, whatever we like to call it, who are feeling that England and France dominated narrative.
I hadn't thought of that. I thought it would be more to do with the language. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I spend a lot of my time reading about early Anglo-Saxon, so I'm very aware that England was 7 different countries.
Well, and then the narrative of Wessex uniting England is still very prominent, especially in popular historical narratives. Certainly among Anglo-Saxonists and in professional early medievalists, they talk about, as you note, the multiple kingdoms. But we still have this narrative that it wasn't a Wessex-dominated campaign to conquer. It was a unification of an inevitable sort where England was a whole that was just waiting for the Alfredian dynasty to take it over.
Which goes back to the Roman period, because England is pretty much what Rome made it.
Right. And then we've got Hispania, right, which then will become eventually Spain. But even in the early modern period, generally in Spanish documents, it's the Spains. It's not Spain. And so we still have another of these issues where we're being anachronistic, and it's not purposeful. It's just that we often tend to see the past through our own modern lens. And nation states make up a huge part of our modern lens.
Thinking on nation states, your forthcoming monograph will cover, you say, an arc from Ireland in the west, Scandinavia in the north, Central Europe, Rus, and then through to Southeast Europe, including Byzantium. Now, I can understand the links of trade, dynasty, politics between adjoining parts of that vast arc region. But are there such strong links between the region as a whole, between Ireland and the Slavic world, or between Scandinavia in the north and Byzantium? What is it that links that whole region?
There's a couple of different things, and actually the arc gets even bigger because I go down to Iberia on the far side as well. So it's almost a horseshoe around the core Western European territories. The reason I decided to do this was multiple fold. I was going to say twofold, but I think it's actually multiple. What we see is not necessarily those links. In reimagining Europe, what I did was I showed how Rus was connected to the rest of Europe through trade, through religion, through dynastic marriage, concrete connections that were made. What I'm trying to do with this project is demonstrate that the normative view of England and France as medieval is not in fact normative. In fact, what we're seeing in this broader territory is much more common. And that's why I wanted to connect multiple different territories and talk about things like rulership. For instance, co-rulership, where there are multiple rulers, is seen as rare in the core territories of Western Europe, unless we're talking about anticipatory association, where a king makes his son a co-king to help with the process of succession. But in fact, in many of the other territories in what I'm calling the arc of medieval Europe, co-rulership is quite common. And it is difficult for medievalists to accept that. And so, for instance, in my Rus, we have multiple people who bear the same title of knyaz. The fact that they bear the same title of knyaz has given English speakers a lot of trouble, because if they are translating knyaz as king, which is what I suggest, a king equals a monarch, and a monarch equals a sole ruler. So they can't possibly be a king. So we're going to call them princes or dukes. The same at the other end of the arc in Portugal, for instance. In Portugal, the king of Portugal, Afonso Henriques, the first king, is a rex, but his mother is the regina. She's the queen. And then Afonso Henriques marries, and his wife is Regina. His mother is also still Regina. He then has daughters, all of whom are also Regina. So there's a moment in Portugal where there are 5 different Reginae, queens. The fact that there are multiple causes problems for our definitions where we view king or queen as solitary. So that's one of the big reasons why I've tried to look at multiple of these areas, is to try and show that in different parts of Europe, there are different ways of doing things. And it's not just Eastern Europe that's odd or the other or different, right? That there are other places that do different things, and that's okay.
You could almost argue that it's the Anglo-Saxon world that's different.
I agree, absolutely. Another big reason that I chose to do this arc is because there is a persistent othering of Eastern and East Central European scholarship. And this is something that I've struggled with, and I know I've talked to many MECERN colleagues about, that there are publishers who are willing to publish on Eastern and East Central Europe, or even Central Europe, talking about it in terms of Bohemia, Poland, Hungary. But those studies are often not integrated into a broader medieval European package. So if we can separate out that territory and connect it to things that fit into the normative view of medieval Europe, like Ireland and Iberia, and increasingly Scandinavia, right, then we face, or maybe better to say, we force the medievalists to engage with that material. If it's just talking about East Central Europe or Eastern Europe, the medievalists who focus traditionally on Western Europe can say, that's something else. I'm not going to deal with that. It's their own part of the world. I'm going to focus on my things. right? But if I can create this arc and get people to buy into this idea that there are these similarities going on in these different areas, it forces them, or at least encourages them more to have to deal with that idea.
So I can see your rationale for identifying this arc, this region, and having lived in much of it, it's certainly not the other, it is not foreign. But how do you study the outer part without fully engaging with what you call the core of Europe? How do you take different interlocking geographical regions and separate them from each other?
That's a really good question, and it's really quite difficult. So one of the pieces that I start with is a theoretical basis, and there has been an enormous amount of work on rulership, specifically kingship, but also queenship in medieval Europe that's focused on those core Western European territories. And so I engage with that theoretical basis and try and utilize it to help understand what's going on. So that's one way I do engage with those territories. Another is that I do deal with some of those differences. So for instance, we see examples that pop up about some of the ways that there are interactions. Croatia is often considered to be right between East and West, given its influence with the Byzantine Empire and with the Roman Church. We also see some of those instances in regards to Ireland, where of course we have English moving in, we have Scandinavians, and it's connected into a wider world. So each chapter has a tendency to focus on a theoretical overview. And then I utilize case studies to talk about specific examples. And those case studies then are going to be native to that particular region. So for instance, when I was talking about monasticism, I was able to talk about the ways that rulers utilized monasticism for the advantage of themselves and their larger families or clans. And I could talk about specific examples from Rus, from Serbia, from Byzantium, from Iberia. I even worked in Wales there because we're seeing some similarities of what's going on. In fact, there's a traditional narrative of dynastic mausolea, right? The entire dynasty has one place where everybody royal is buried. But in fact, in the 11th and 12th centuries, that's more rare than we see later. In the 13th century, dynastic mausolea are constructed. And again, here I go back to those core territories and show that Saint-Denis in France is one of the main places that constructs that idea. But we see one ruler create a monastery for himself and his wife, or his wife and his kids. And then his successor or successor by one or two creates a new monastery for himself and his wife, for his kids. It's not an idea that the entire clan must be buried in one place. It's really about the self-aggrandizement of the ruler and what we might call a nuclear family rather than a larger clan or dynasty. We also see some real similarities between what's going on, for instance, in Iberia, in the kingdom of Leon and Castile, and in the medieval Roman Empire, which we normally call Byzantium, where we see dual monasteries, male and female, founded in both places, where female royal control is prominent. And these are territories that would never be studied together. No one is going to look at Iberian monasticism and Byzantine monasticism in the same breath. But by creating this arc of medieval Europe, I'm trying to do that. And I hope what will come out of it is that some of those scholars will see those similarities and think, oh, I need to do more of this, right? What I want to do is not the be all and end all at all, right? I want to advance some possibilities, point some things out, and hope that it spurs on further research and interest in developing these ideas.
I could well imagine that it would. You're talking about the themes of your book, and I know from your papers you've structured the book around 5 themes, each being a major chapter. The themes are succession, titulature, ecclesiastical relations, governance structure, conflict, and connectivity. Why did you choose these specific themes? And as another thought, while you're focusing on these themes and rulers and rulership, you're only looking at the top layer of politics within each society. Do you ever look at the society below? and the interaction between different layers of society?
Yeah, to start at the end, I do focus just on the elites. Absolutely. That's not entirely popular these days with the
Mhm.
still continuing influence of social history and looking at what's going on in the population. But it is what I'm interested in, and it is also what we have sources for the most part. We don't have a lot of sources for what's going on among the average folks, especially in a lot of Eastern Europe. And that's going to be a problem, especially since what I want to do is do comparative work across this broad territory. I need to focus on things that we do have evidence for. And so that's one of the reasons I've done that. The structure of the book has expanded even a little bit more as I've dug down into some of those things, as you might imagine. Succession has been an issue of mine that I've been interested in, as is titulature. I wrote a short book called Kingdom of Rus about titles in the Kingdom of Rus, suggesting that Knyaz should be king. Succession is related to that, and so is co-rulership. And so succession, titulature, and co-rulership now make up the first third of the book. The second third is now going to be that ecclesiastical relations and monastic ties that I was just talking about, and how, and not just the monasticism part, but the ecclesia part, where rulers utilized the church to create or enhance their own power. And that's where I'm looking at examples from Hungary, from Croatia, and from other places to try and understand the ways that rulers were able to, or churches were able to engage in political power. And here too, we see similarities with what's going on in different regions. For instance, Hungary, of course, is very famous for having two archbishoprics in the 11th century, so soon after Christianization. It's incredibly rare to have something like that. And one of them technically has no suffragans, at least initially. Rus is the closest parallel, because in the middle of the 11th century, approximately at the same time, they have three archbishops, and two of them seem to have no suffragans. So whether those are named ad personam, right, it's just archbishop for this guy, or we have something else going on, it's useful to put them in conversation with each other. The third of the book is this governance and conflict section, and that's what I'm specifically working on during my fellowship time at the National Humanities Center. That is where my reading and research is taking place right now, and I'm still in the stage when it looks like I'm going to have 5 to 7 different chapters on 33 different themes, and I don't know what I'm going to do. So governance and conflict is where I'm starting as kind of an umbrella. But there are so many issues that go into this. For instance, taxation. Chris Wickham, a famous Oxford scholar, has talked about taxation as the governing principle of medieval European politics. And of course, his focus is on the core of Western Europe. But also this idea that there is a bureaucratic state and a centralized state seems to have come to prominence in Anglophone studies on rulership. But we don't really see bureaucratic states in the 11th and 12th century, especially in the places where I'm looking. If you look at the charter output of what's going on in the core territories of Western Europe, it is through the roof compared to anything that we have in the arc of medieval Europe. Poland doesn't have documentary evidence like this until the later part of the 12th century. Where I believe we have something like 5 charters in the 12th century, compared to some hundreds per year in England at the same time during the reign of Henry II. So when we look at these sorts of governance issues, we need to get away from the fact that there are bureaucracies and that there are central places, or at least there can be multiple central places. Hungary, of course, is a great example, where you've got Esztergom, right? But you've also got Buda, and you've also got some other places where rulers spend their time. Kiev in Rus is going to be a central place. In Scandinavia, we have multiple central places, and a lot of our rulers are simply itinerant. They move around from place to place, and they govern while they are there, and they eat up the surplus while they are there. And that is their way of taking tribute and taxation. It's not a centralized documentary form like we might see in the medieval Roman Empire, or we see developing in the England and France of the 12th and into the 13th centuries. So I really still am wrestling with how best to address a lot of those other governmental issues. I need to get into the case studies a little bit more and develop it a little bit more. A lot of what I've been doing thus far is reading in theory. There were 3 books that came out in 2021 on rulership largely focusing on Western Europe. And so getting into those and thinking about those and how they apply to my field has eaten up some time too, to try and engage with that scholarship and let medieval European historians know that even if they're not reading our stuff, we're reading their stuff, right? And what I would like is for the arc of medieval Europe to kind of fit, Lego style onto some of that work that's been done for the core territories of Western medieval Europe. And so I need to focus on some of the same themes that they're focusing on, so those pieces engage with one another.
I've just thought, if you listen to a lot of the Western media, it seems to look at US, France, Germany, UK, and the other. I wonder if we're looking at the medieval world through our lens.
100%, I would agree with that statement. I have a good friend in Serbia, in Belgrade, who maintains that when the English conquered the world and then the Americans followed suit, that they tried to impose an Anglophone order on the world that doesn't fit with a lot of the ways the rest of the world does business, engages with one another, etc.
I would agree with that. We've talked about the geographical area you're looking at, but we haven't tackled the period. You're going to be studying 1000 AD to 1200. Why did you pick that specific period?
Right. And this is always the question. How do you define your research geographically, chronologically, those sorts of things? And you have to limit it because you can't do everything. But 1000 to 1200 seems to work very well for the variables that I'm looking at, given that a lot of the kingdoms, polities, may be more accurate, that were created in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia are actually created at the end of the 10th century or during the course of the 10th century. So we can talk about them as part of the Christian ecumene, the Christian larger world, as part of the 11th century. So 1000 seems a pretty decent place to start. It's also a round number and works well for a variety of reasons. I can't get out of my head the publishing possibilities, right? You do need, as an academic now, to try and figure out how to fit into the boxes that publishers will allow you. And this project already crosses some lines of boxes. And so it's hard enough. So if I have a chronological box that fits, it's going to at least help me a little bit. 1200 is a change for me. 1300 is where I was first looking at the extent of this project. I wanted to deal with the Golden Bull in Hungary. But I really thought, as I got into the material more, that the 13th century is different. The 13th century does see a rise in bureaucratization. It does see a rise of nobles engaged more actively in management of the court. We see named officials beginning to do more. We see central places increased. And we also see a variety of changes in governance. For instance, in Scandinavia, we see all kinds of changes that have to do with increasing Christianization, royal coronation, even the joining of kingdoms. Thus, I thought, since what I'm trying to do is demonstrate that there is an alternative example to the normative view of English and French monarchy, I needed to create a period in which that was the case, right? And so that seems maybe not ideal in shaping my ideas for an audience, but I really think after 1300, one of the things that's going on is we see that other polities in the arc of medieval Europe are consciously, I would say even self-consciously, modeling themselves on what's going on in the Anglo-French core. The terminological changes in Scandinavia, where they replace native terms with Anglo-French terms, is just one example. Right? They're trying to be part of what they view as that core territory of Western Europe. And if we flip on its head Bartlett's idea of the making of medieval Europe, a book he wrote in the 90s, where he talked about, quote unquote, the Europeanization of Europe, which I often talk about as the Frankification of Europe, because what he's really talking about is when the Franks expand into Scandinavia and Eastern Europe and they make that world European, right? By which he means Frankish, right, or more Germanic. Then by the 13th century, I think we're actually seeing the fulfillment of some of that. And that's also when we get increased othering of Rus, for example, after 1204 in the Fourth Crusade, the arrival of the Mongols, the declaration by Pope Honorius of crusade directly against Orthodox peoples. So I think the 13th century developed over the course of my research into an area that was too complicated to fit into this and deserves its own focus. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why there's so much work on, well, everybody's got a long century, the long 18th century, the long 13th century, but that's maybe one of the places to look at.
Yes. You say that Rus was the other, having lived there for some years. It very much still is. It feels very different there.
It's a real problem. And one of the things that I have been utterly grateful to MECERN about is including Rus, because certainly they didn't have to. It is East Central and Eastern Europe. It does not have to include Rus. Very prominent, really good work focuses on East Central Europe without including Rus. So I am just grateful that MECERN has included Rus in their remit to talk about this as part of a larger medieval European world.
Yeah. Do you think you will ever move on and research just the 13th century? Because the way you were just talking about it, it sounds really fascinating.
I think it is really fascinating, and I don't think I will. Antti Sellart, an Estonian scholar, has done terrific work on the 13th century, talking about the interactions in the Baltic region between all the various groups. He knows the ins and outs of that so well. The next projects I have lined up are more specific. For instance, I want to write a book just on Rusian queens. Right. And so just talking about the powers that they did and did not have, their lives, that's something that I have dabbled in a little bit in talking about Rusian women, but not ever addressing the idea that they might be queens and rulers in their own right. So, that's what I'd like to move on to next and kind of stay in this 11th and 12th century world and just poke around and see what else is going on there rather than move later.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You have suggested that your book will encourage scholars to reflect on how our modern political structures, obviously in the terms of physical structures, borders, capitals, but also mental structures, how that's influenced our current construction of medieval Europe. However, medieval Europe also has a major impact on our modern political structures. As a final question, please, could you reflect on the interplay of influence in Europe over the millennium?
Absolutely. There's been some really interesting work that has been done and is being done on the ways that we think about otherness in Europe and the divisions within Europe. Most well known is the Invention of Eastern Europe by Larry Wolff, that talks about how the Enlightenment was really the thing that helped to create Eastern Europe as a different, right, as an other, separate. More recently, Paul Milliman, who's at the University of Arizona, has pushed that back into the early modern period and even the late medieval period, thinking about how there is this Eastern other. I was on a dissertation a few years ago at CEU where there was a scholar working on this same idea, talking about how Rus, Russia, Muscovy, and it was changing over the period, was viewed as an other. And so there are these times over the course of the last millennium where we have created these ideas that Europe is not an entity. It is, in fact, several entities. In modern scholarship, the most classic division of this is where we see after the 7th century rise of Islam, we see that now it was three powers that divided medieval Europe: the Muslims, the Orthodox, and the Latin Christians. And this is anachronistic. There is no, as I've argued on multiple occasions, there's no division really between the Latin and the Orthodox in most of the medieval period that I'm looking at. And we don't get strong differences among actual people, not ecclesiastics engaged in disputation, until the 13th century, when we see those crusades established. But this is an idea that's firmly rooted itself within the historiography. And you can see that even in classic works, the Cambridge History of Medieval Europe, was created in the early part of the 20th century, and Byzantium and the entirety of Eastern Europe is relegated to one volume, and it's separated out. And part of the rationale by J.B. Bury is that it doesn't have a lot to do with the rest of Europe. I mean, flat out in the introduction, why he does this. So this is not new to the 21st century. This is a long problem that you can trace back to Ronca or to others in thinking about why there is this division. I would suggest that during the 11th and 12th century, there's not this division, right? That in fact, there are all kinds of travelers, pilgrims, traders who are going all over the place. And pilgrims is an interesting one. There's just been some good work demonstrating that pilgrims from Novgorod in the northern part of Rus went all the way to Santiago Compostela in the northern part of Iberia. That's wonderful. I mean, this is talking about interconnectivity, about the lack of difference between these religious spheres. This is just wonderful. In the same way, we have people, of course, going from England to Byzantium and vice versa. We have all of this interaction and interconnectivity. I was just reading a piece this morning in Florin Curta's excellent Rutledge Handbook of East Central and Eastern Europe, talking about Jews. And the article is about how there are these Jewish communities in East Central and Eastern Europe. They correspond with Jewish communities in England, in Germany, in Iberia. So there are these ties of all sorts connecting medieval Europe together. So I would suggest that at least for the period that I'm interested in, there is a unity that we can call medieval Europe, and that divisions occur only later. But once those divisions occur, they get read back into history and become reified through the separation of all kinds of things. So for instance, if you want a job as a medievalist, generally you're somebody who focuses on England or France, maybe Iberia more recently. A medievalist isn't somebody who works on Russia, they're a Russianist. They exist in a Slavic sphere. People who work on Byzantium are in classics departments, even though they might work on Byzantium in the 12th century. That is certainly not the classical world. When you publish books, Cambridge, for instance, has a medieval editor and a Byzantine studies editor and a Slavic editor. Right. So if I was publishing my book with Cambridge, and they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, I'm sure, then who do I go to talk about that? Because they have created institutional silos that break up the area that I'm trying to talk about. So this is actually a really pervasive problem that writing one book or even a dozen books isn't going to fix without fixing some of the larger structural issues that create barriers between worlds that were, at the time, interconnected.
Interesting thoughts you make on separation, otherness, mental functional silos. I think they're very well made, and they still influence our lives so much as people move around. They are still others and separate. On that interesting note, I think we must end here. Thank you so much for your time and explaining your ideas and your research to us. I just hope that maybe this time next year we'll repeat this exercise and you can talk about your final book. I would be so interested to hear about it.
That would be delightful. I would love that. And if any of the listeners have questions, I'm easy to find online. Please email me and ask. I love, of course, to talk about these ideas.
Then you will probably get many MECERN members coming up and asking you what's happening.
Delightful.
Christian, thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Karen, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
And you.
Bye-bye.